Good evening and welcome to the world today. Tonight we're going to discuss the Balfour Declaration, a declaration which may not be so well known in South America, but is very well known in the Arab world and especially in Palestine, Israel, because this was the declaration made by the British Prime Minister of the day, Balfour, promising the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. With me is Bernard Regan, a highly respected leader, former leader of the National Union of Teachers in Britain, a staunch supporter of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who has written a book on the Balfour Declaration, which is one of the most detailed and best researched studies of what actually happened and why it happened. The analysis of the book is sharp, and in these days where a lot of history is being wiped out, it is important to understand what took place 100 years ago, because 1917 was not just the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which has been marked different parts of the world. It was also, 2017 is also the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And my late friend Edward Said always used to say that for him, the most important thing about 1917 was the Balfour Declaration and not the events that took place in Russia. Bernard, welcome. In your book, you argue that the decision by the British imperial government to push through the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in 1917, and then obviously accelerating after the First World War, was a decision made not so much out of any regard for the Jews, except to get as many of them out of Britain and Europe as possible, but out of imperial self-interest. Could you explain that?
Well, I think if you examine, and this is what the book has tried to do, the war cabinet discussions, the leadership of the British government at the time during the First World War, and you look at the various papers that were presented, looking at the arguments, it's very clear that running through that as a strong thread is a determination to protect the empire, particularly India, and critical to that was the Suez Canal. So the placing of Palestine where it was strategically important to the British for three reasons. One was, as I've mentioned, India, but also East Africa. The other was the Suez Canal. But the third element, which I think is underplayed, and was the importance of oil and the fact that oil was becoming a critical commodity during the First World War, the vast expansion of machinery that required oil, the transfer in 1912 by Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty, of the British military fleet, the Royal Navy, from coal-fired to oil-fired, which meant that the capacity of the vessels to travel was increased by 50%. Those who were on board were reduced in terms of those who were employed in keeping the ships running. So it was a transformation, and you had the growth of air warfare, you had the introduction of tanks and all sorts of things. So oil became a critical issue, and between about 1911 and I think the 1920, something like that, the import of oil by the British increased 11-fold. And I think it's something that's kind of omitted, and it was nevertheless in the cabinet discussions very consciously referred to. Kitchener, when he was asked to write a paper on the Middle East and British strategy for it, wrote a paper called Mesopotamia to Alexandretta, which was an alternative fulcrum, if you like, or pivot for the way the British would operate. So I think this is a beginning of a shift that is taking place in terms of kind of British preoccupations and strategic interests that kind of impelled them to look afresh at Palestine. And the other side of that coin was that they were also concerned about the French. There was great rivalry between the French and the British, particularly over the area of what we now call Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, which those who lived there at the time referred to as Greater Syria, and always envisaged as a unity, as an entity of itself, rather than kind of distinct countries. And the French wanted to assert their control over that part of the Arab East. And it was part of that rivalry, which was also an issue that propelled it in importance in the British views.
Well, this makes a lot of sense, of course, in terms of British imperial priorities. But did they need to bring the Jewish population of Eastern Europe and elsewhere into this region? Why couldn't they just have created a set of military bases in some of the Arab countries which were already under their control and under their hegemony? Was it necessary to create a different state? What were the reasons for that?
I think that is an interesting question. I mean, after all, in other parts of the world, they'd, as it were, enlisted local classes, comprador classes, to act in their interests.
Or tribes, as
exactly.
in Africa.
Yes. And I think part of the answer to the question is that the Ottoman Empire was subject to what were known as capitulations. In other words, they gave to foreigners who lived in the Ottoman Empire concessions over and above those of people whom they directly ruled, which meant that they were subject to the rule of their own country. So the French, for example, had a responsibility for concern for Christians in the area, the Russians for Russian Orthodox. And if the British were to seek to establish some kind of base in the area as part of this strategic objective that I talked about, then they needed some kind of excuse, if you like, some way in which they perceived they could legitimize them expressing an interest. And in addition to that, the conflict with France was, and this goes back to Sykes-Picot and the famous drawing of the different areas of responsibility that they presumed. The area of Palestine was an area which was conflictual in the sense that the French aspired to control it, and the British needed some legitimating reason to say why it should not be under French control. And in fact, it wasn't until really, I suppose, around about 1916 that this became concretized, when Sykes saw the value of being able to employ the Zionist arguments in order to kind of give that legitimacy to the British so that they could claim that they had an interest which they had to defend, or a people whom they had to defend. The other thing to say, of course, is that it was perfectly true that at the same time that they were talking about creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, they were simultaneously trying to exclude Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. In 1905, Balfour was the Prime Minister who was responsible for the Aliens Act, which was the first piece of anti-immigrant legislation that actually tried to prescribe who should enter the country. This was the same scenario in America and in other parts of the world as well. There was a reluctance to accept that these people should be able to come into the country.
I mean, what is also quite interesting is that the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, Montagu, was completely opposed to this declaration and saw it for what it was, as an attempt to discourage Jews from settling in Britain.
He was the only Jewish member of the cabinet. But in terms of the Jewish community in Britain, the majority, not overwhelming, but the majority of leading representatives of the Jewish community were also anti-Zionist. They regarded Weizmann as not an eccentric, but certainly as someone outside of the framework of conventional Jewish community and culture and politics as they saw it, and someone who was bringing in something which was alien to what they had wanted. They had wanted to become part of, indeed many of them were, part of the British establishment, like the Rothschilds themselves, and they didn't want to see that disturbed. Their argument was, which had some legitimacy, was that by creating this land to which Jews would have as a homeland, this might encourage the anti-Semitic view, well, all Jews should leave the country. And so that was their anxiety. And they weren't alone. There were in other parts of Europe, that was a similar view expressed by leading members of Jewish communities in those other countries.
I mean, coming now to the Zionist movement, because the formation of this homeland, the creation of Israel, is the result of two concurrent things. One, the interest of the British Empire to have, a pliant state in the region, which, though Jewish, would nonetheless do the bidding of the British as long as they wanted it to. And the other was the desire of Theodor Herzl, the leader of the Zionist movement, and an Austrian who'd been disturbed by the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Austria, to take this opportunity to create an ethnic Jewish homeland, a sort of nation for the Jewish people, and to do which he made all sorts of compromises, as we know, and as your book recounts, made the journey to Tsarist Russia to meet with von Plever, the deeply reactionary Tsarist government minister, vile anti-Semite, and said this will be of help to you as well, because a lot of Russian Jews who are giving you so much trouble could come to the new homeland. So it was a very cynical operation.
Completely. As you say, he visited imperial leader after imperial leader. He went round...
he met the Kaiser?
Yes, and the President of France, and so on and so forth. And indeed, he went to the Sultan to speak in the Ottoman Empire to try to get them to adopt a more sympathetic position. And indeed, he had some success in Germany. There was certainly a discussion about how they might respond. And this was later, of course, on the eve of the First World War and during the beginning of it. And the Germans sent a note round their embassies, basically saying that the embassies and consulates in the Middle East should afford particular succor and protection to Jews seeking help. So they were seeking to respond to the Zionists. And indeed, for a long time, there was a belief that the Zionists were likely to be more pro-German than they were to be pro-British, because World Zionism had its headquarters in Berlin, just round the corner from the German Foreign Office, and there were also Christian Zionist movements inside Germany which expressed sympathy for the idea. And so it was perfectly plausible to think that Zionism actually might side with Germany and that Germany might respond. But it didn't, in the end, it didn't go far enough from the point of view of the Zionist perspective.
Of course, the other plan was, which was a proposal from the British, I think, to offer the Zionist movement a homeland in the Rift Valley, in Kenya.
Yes.
And even Madagascar was considered as a possible homeland. But this was rejected by the Zionists because they had these ideas of a biblical, mythical, biblical past, etc.
It wasn't rejected out of hand. I mean, within Zionism, there were different political currents. There was the one which became the dominant one around 1905, which was to say we want that homeland to be established in Palestine. But there were the others who simply wanted to have land anywhere in which a homeland could be created. And they were called the territorialists. They were more amenable to those ideas. And as you mentioned, Kenya was one possible location, but also Argentina, Canada, Cyprus, and Sinai was another project which was projected by the British. And they went quite far on this because in 1903, Balfour actually set this out. He went to a young member of parliament and asked this young member of parliament to draft a charter very much on the lines of the East India Company, which was going to be the framework under which this homeland would be established. And this young member of parliament was in fact Lloyd George, and he was the one who drafted out this proposal, which was to create a Jewish homeland within East Africa, in Kenya, as you've mentioned. And that would be one in which there would be kind of self-government, but it would be under the aegis of the British
Empire.
It would be a protectorate. But it was certainly a very serious project, and for quite a period of time. Indeed, Herzl himself he wasn't ambiguous about it, but he was prepared to consider it, although his ambition and the ambition subsequently of the World Zionist Organization was quite adamant it had to be Palestine. But that wasn't how things had begun.
So it was fortuitous, really, that they landed up in Palestine. Because, I mean, let's just do a counter-narrative of the history. Had the Allies not won the First World War, had the Americans not come in, had there been a compromise settlement between the British and German empires, it's unlikely that they would have agreed on creating this homeland, Bernard. Or let's say if the Ottomans and the Germans and their gang had won the First World War, it's very unlikely that this particular state would have come into being. And to that one can add another side of it, that, you know, horrific though it seems to even discuss it, but had Rommel not been stopped in the desert during the Second World War, so it would have been, and you know, there's little doubt what the Germans would have done had they taken that part of the world. So it was touch and go in both world wars.
Yes, I mean, it's you know, there are a whole plethora of scenarios you can envisage as alternatives. The one that I tried to look at, not as projecting what might have been, but as kind of, I think, an absence in a lot of the discussion about Balfour and about Palestine, is the whole narrative of what actually happened to the Palestinians. They're written out, and I think it's one of the things that I think is crucial is to try to re-establish their role within this situation, because they were very conscious of what was happening from the point of view of Zionism.
Yes, but also it's worth recalling that there were two currents amongst the Jewish settler communities. There was one current which was non-Zionist as such and said we should just live there like anyone else and not create a state with a military and a police and all that, but just go and live with the Palestinian people.
Yes, I mean, and that was encompassed in the Palestinian congresses, which took place from 1919 through the early 1920s. On several occasions, they stated quite clearly that anyone or those who had lived in Palestine should be entitled to stay, and that included the Mizrahi, the Arab Jews, and those people who lived there. And they said that they should have full rights. And it's very interesting, the position that the Palestinians took in relation to that, because it contrasts with Balfour and the Balfour Declaration and the way they expressed it. They talk about the non-Jewish community having civic and religious rights, but they don't talk about them having political rights. In other words, their right to self-determination or national identity is nowhere expressed there. In contrast to that, the Palestinians' congresses quite explicitly said those people who lived within the area should be entitled to stay and have full rights of citizenship within that. So there was a very much a contrast in respect of how that was envisaged. And within the Jewish community, you had therefore the split between the Eastern European Zionists and the Mizrahi who were living there, largely a religious community, Arabic-speaking, completely integrated into the society, and who themselves actually regarded the Eastern Europeans as rather shocking in their behavior, quite alien, quite contrary to them, and distasteful, and they found it kind of quite problematic. It wasn't until perhaps the end of the 20s that we begin to see a shift in that with events that took place towards the end there, particularly in 1929, of course.
And Bernard, what was the opposition within the British establishment to the Balfour Declaration? You said earlier that it was quite significant.
In preparation for the drafting of the Balfour document, the British canvassed what they regarded as leading Jewish opinion, and this tended to be people in prominent positions who were in the same social milieu to which the British ruling class came from, so people like the Rothschilds and so on and so forth. And within that, those responses, some of them were very, very strong indeed in terms of saying essentially that Judaism is a religion, it is not a nationality. We retain our allegiance to the country in which we live, although we practice our faith and so on. Others made expressed similar concerns to the ones we've talked about in terms of the fear of the expansion of anti-Semitism in response to the creation of a homeland. So that was quite widespread, but there were also others who, in the British ruling class, some of whom undoubtedly were anti-Semitic, and there was a Churchill, for example, whose comments were, in my view, quite clearly anti-Semitic in his approach to it, but nevertheless finished up in the eyes of some historians as the champion of Zionism and so on. So that's very much the case.
And if you look at what happened subsequently, of course, it's obvious that the creation of Israel was given an enormous impetus by the horrors of the Second World War. I mean, it's an open question, I think, of what might have happened had either the fascists not come to power in Germany, or if there had been a group of extreme right-wingers for whom the question of Jews was not an important one at all, as in Italian fascism, when if you look at the early lists of Mussolini's party in Italy, lots of Jewish, rich Jews, millionaires, etc., were members of the party. And he turned anti-Semitic only after the victory of the Germans, because they were part of an alliance. So had there not been an anti-Semitic surge and triumph in Germany, it is an open question as to how successful this project might have been. I mean, the Judeo side of the Second World War made it obvious that some state was going to be created, and no one in Europe was going to oppose it because of what had happened. But had that not happened, would such a state in the form which it took have been created, or would it have been possible? Who knows?
I think one of the other questions, which for me remains unanswered, of course, is how or in what way the scenario would have changed radically if the Palestinians had been successful in conducting an anti-imperialist struggle for the creation of a Palestinian state, and in what context that would have grown and developed within the Middle East and within the Arab world as a whole. And that would have, I think, contributed to a changed scenario. Throughout all of the period, and there is very few areas that one can identify where this wasn't the case, legislation existed in all of the countries of the Entente Cordiale, the alliance rather, in terms of America, in terms of Canada, Australia, Britain, and so on, which excluded Jews from seeking haven, seeking refuge, and that added to the crisis. Undoubtedly, that was part of the problem, and so there are a number of major questions that come into that, I think, in terms of discussing it.
Yeah, it is an interesting discussion. I mean, the thing is, the Palestinians did have, I think, a general strike, if my memory is right, for 3 years. Or off and on strike.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, I'm laughing because that's a second book if I ever get to write it. The period of 36-39 was a massive uprising by the Palestinians. It included, as you said, a general strike. It included the formation of committees in local areas which were organizing the local community in terms of providing resources to guerrilla fighters who were conducting armed struggle against the British. And there were periods within that during which there were ceasefires and periods of temporary peace, if you like, or non-conflict. But eventually, of course, that was defeated. And I think that was really the critical moment that prepared the ground for 1947-48. And it's not actually talked about very much what happened during that period of time. The British conducted armed attack against the Palestinian uprising. They bombed it, and this was, it's ironic, but remember this is 36-39, when the Spanish Guernica are killing the Republicans in this exactly the same minute, in the same time the British are bombing Palestinians. And they were well armed, they were conducting an armed struggle of some substance, and as I said, it was not, there is perhaps a post hoc painting of this as kind of guerrilla kind of activity in a sense of being remote from the populace, but that wasn't the case. It was something that was
very
quite
popular,
integrated.
yes.
And I think that was really, tragically, the moment at which the momentum of the fight for, or the campaign for Palestinian independence was really faced with the bloc, because they were disarmed, and of course the Second World War then ensued, and at that time the Haganah and the Israeli proto-state army, which had been created as early as the 1920s, by the way, in 1921-22, when the Haganah was formed, became integrated into the British military structure, and throughout the period of the Second World War, therefore, was actually conducting military operations, and at the same time that the Palestinians were disarmed, so that by the time you get to 47 and 48 and the Nakba, in my view, it becomes very difficult to the Palestinians to conduct a resistance against the terrorism which they face, that we know well about in terms of what happened in Deir Yassin and all those other tragedies that we are too familiar with.
And the Arab armies, which supposedly came to their help, and technically they did come to their help, were, in my opinion, almost worse than useless.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
They didn't really put up a fight. Most of these armies were under the influence of the British in any event.
That, but also from a technical point of view, they were poorly armed, they were poorly trained. They had none of the kind of capacities that the Haganah had acquired, and the paramilitaries within the Zionist community in Palestine had acquired throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. So they didn't have the military capacity, and the Zionists had more soldiers under arms than all of those foreign or Arab countries combined. And the idea that they were facing kind of elimination, I think is somewhat exaggerated. The real balance of forces, I think, was never negative from the point of view of Zionists, and they were always in a strong position. And of course, the British left equipment, which was also utilised by them. So it was not quite so kind of existential crisis that they paint, I don't think.
We're now 100 years on from the Balfour Declaration, and whereas other centenaries are really history now, in the sense that the Russian Revolution, we look at it as history.
Yes.
Many other similar events of 100 years ago.
Yes.
But the Balfour Declaration is not simply history, because its outcome is such that the Palestinians are still suffering.
Yeah. You only have to just reflect for a moment. It's not only is the situation of the Palestinians still a consequence of Balfour, and that's reflected in what is happening within Palestinian society, but it is also true of the whole of the Arab East. The Americans are involved. The Americans were not directly militarily involved in 1914, 1917, but they were giving substantial material support to the British in order that the British could carry out their actions. And of course, there was a stage at which, certainly in Syria, they wanted a mandate to be given to the Americans rather than the French or the British. So the Americans are back, if you like, in play, but in a direct way. The Russians are back in play in the Middle East too, So all of those components are right back there where we were with Sykes-Picot. So it's Balfour, but it's the whole problematic of what was happening in the area at the time of the First World War, around the moment at which Balfour occurred. And those components, in many respects, are still there today.
Bernie, on that unhappy note, we'll come to an end. Thanks very much.
I enjoyed that. Thank you, Tariq.